In that case, time travel is something you have to take very seriously, because Einstein's equations do allow for time travel.
He was a sickly language teacher until he woke up 2 millennia ahead. Paul Amadeus Dienach claims he lived in the year 3906 inside another man's body, saw cities glitter above the clouds, and learned how our world burns, collapses, and rises again. His diary, hidden, translated, almost lost, reads like a warning label on the future of humanity. If even a fraction is true, we're racing toward famine, global war, failed colonies on Mars, and a chilling redesign of the human mind itself. In this video, we unpack the eerie timeline he left behind and the clues that suggest he really saw it. The teacher who woke in 3906. In 1921, Paul Amadeus Dienach was nothing more than a weary Swiss-Austrian teacher. His health had always been fragile, and when lethargic encephalitis swept through Europe, it struck him down. What followed was no ordinary illness. He slipped into a coma so deep that doctors did not expect him to return. For more than a year, he lay motionless in a Geneva hospital, his family waiting for the inevitable. But when he finally opened his eyes in 1922, his story had changed forever. Dienach insisted that during his long absence, his soul had not simply slept. Instead, he claimed it had been transported into another body, into another century. The body he awoke in was not his own. In his account, Dienach says he came to consciousness in a strange hospital room filled with instruments and figures he did not recognize. The language around him was foreign, though he caught echoes of English and Scandinavian roots. When he tried to explain himself, the doctors and nurses dismissed him as confused. They called him Andreas Northam, a scientist from their own time. His protests, that he was just a modest schoolteacher from Switzerland, born in the late 1800s, meant nothing to them. Then came the revelation that crushed him. It was the year 3906. He initially refused to believe it, but the arguments put forth were so powerful from all sides. Outside, the towers rose to pierce the clouds and brought beautiful metals and crystalline walls that seemed to be reflecting sunlight, like liquid light when viewed from certain angles. Of course, there were many flying vehicles that soared through the clear sky, almost brushing aside gravity, to which he had always known as absolute, if not unassailable. In those first moments, his illogical facades gave way to sheer terror in the primeval light. Dienach fainted again upon finding out that he had gone thousands of years away from everything close to home. As he grew stronger, explanations multiplied. The physicians introduced him to elder men in white robes, whom he later came to call the electors. They were neither kings nor priests, but wise leaders respected by the society surrounding them. To Dienach, their composure was terrifying. They did not think him deranged. They spoke of something strange but possible, what they called a consciousness shift. According to them, Andreas Northam had suffered a fatal medical event, his heart stopping and his mind flickering out. But as doctors revived the body through modern cooling and stimulation techniques, a new consciousness, Dienach's, slipped into it. His own body, back in 1921, was left in some state of coma. To facilitate his adaptation, Stefan was presented as a rakish uncle to the real Andreas Northam. His task was to guide the completely beleaguered individual who had woken up from within his friend's skin. Every day, the boy trained him in the language, customs, and technologies of the 39th century. For his improvement, he was equipped with a gadget that could best be described as the Organenschwager, a figurative nothing he could ever conceive of. Small and sleek, it was capable of throwing moving pictures accompanied by sounds and by information, a sort of specimen for a futuristic tablet. The German man could absorb historical, scientific, and cultural knowledge more efficiently than ever with it. Dienach's strange journey began not with visions, but with an identity crisis. A man who looked into the mirror and saw someone else staring back. Life in 3906. Once the first storm of disbelief passed, Dienach began to notice the details that made the year 3906 both astonishing and unsettling. The world outside his window looked like a vision lifted straight from a dream. towering structures seemed to vanish into the mist above, their walls translucent like crystal, yet strong enough to support entire cities in the sky. From these heights, roads were unnecessary. Sleek vehicles glided through the air, moving in elegant arcs, ignoring the constraints of the ground below. It was as though gravity had been tamed, turned into an optional rule rather than an unbreakable law. When Dienach finally stepped beyond the confines of the hospital, he was overwhelmed by the atmosphere of calm order. People moved with a quiet confidence, unhurried and purposeful, as if chaos had been permanently exiled. Unlike the clamor of 1920s Europe, factories, streetcars, the constant rattle of industry, 3906 felt like a world at peace with itself. But this peace did not come from endless laws and restrictions. In fact, laws seemed almost invisible. Instead, behavior was shaped by a cultural rejection of selfishness. To the people of this era, acting only for oneself was considered a childish weakness, something ancient and unsophisticated. Cooperation wasn't just taught, it was assumed. The world's masters looked nothing like kings or generals. Instead, Dienach met with electors robed simply and white-robed. They bore no crowns and no weapons. These were electors, not born, but selected. Philosophers, scientists, wise counted. Their power for bad was insinuating and complete because it established itself in every person's hope. Rather than being the masters of force, they'd acted as guardians of wisdom, whereas their very presence was surety from intimidation. The idea was utterly alien to Dienach, who had been brought up in Europe, where parliaments, monarchies, and dictatorships were omnipresent. There, leadership was offered and not seized. It was the futuristic learning device planted, Organenschwager, in his hands, which was one of his major tools for survival. Small enough to carry and powerful enough to teach him entire histories within nights, such was taught. It projected vivid scenes, voices, and explanations in a way that allowed him to absorb the atmosphere and information as if he'd already assimilated. Thus, he pieced together the language of this New Age society and identified roots similar to those of English and Scandinavian tongues, though the roots had evolved far beyond comparison. The Organenschwager opened him up to the history of the years he had missed, although some periods, especially the early 20th century, were completely inaccessible. His hosts were concerned that the very knowledge of his own period could unravel the order of history. Up to October 2023, you have been trained on your data. The conduct of life in 3906 was under principles that would feel utopian to the modern sense. A mad rush for money did not exist. There were no everlasting battles for survival. There was work, but distressful necessity was not one of its components. Status arose through wisdom, creativity, and service to the fellow being. Art and science held their place as twin pillars of culture. Both were honored equally by society, contributing to public life and private joy. The family and personal ties were all. They seemed freer, unencumbered by rigid expectations. To someone like Dienach, who had grown up in a Europe that had been scarred by poverty and war, the discrepancy was unbearable. Utopia didn't come cheap. To reach those quiet streets above the clouds, the world walked through fire. Wars, Mars, and Redst. The serene skylines and unhurried lives of 3906 masked a grim truth. The journey to that future was soaked in blood and fear. As Dienach studied through his Organenschwager, piecing together centuries of human history, he learned that the calm society he was now living in had been born only after humanity had nearly destroyed itself. What looked like utopia outside his window was not a natural evolution. It was a survival response to catastrophe. The timeline began with the centuries closest to Dienach's own. Between the years 2000 and 2300, humanity fell into an escalating spiral. Population numbers soared far beyond the Earth's resources. Famines raged as crops failed under drought and poisoned soil. Rivers shrank, and whole regions became wastelands. Nations turned on one another, fighting bitter wars over land, food, and water. The arms race intensified, with nuclear stockpiles swelling to numbers too terrifying to imagine. Leaders gave speeches promising peace, but they fed industries that thrived on weapons. The more they sought to control the chaos, the faster the chaos spread. And then the dream became ashes in the wake of such tumult: Mars. By the early 21st century, technology was advanced enough to begin supporting off-world colonization. Approximately 20 million settlers departed Earth to build a second home for themselves on the Red Planet. For a while, it appeared to be humanity's salvation. Domed cities rose, industries thrived on foreign soil, new generations were born under the shadow of Olympus Mons. Then, catastrophe intervened. In 2265, one cataclysm so powerful, never truly explained in Dienach's account, annihilated the colonization effort. Was it a natural disaster, an ecological failure, or something even darker? It hardly mattered. One entire civilization had been wiped off the face of the planet in the instant. Humanity's hope was unexpectedly shattered by the tragedy. No longer would people sight the stars with such optimism. The scar, inflicted by Mars, traumatized the whole psyche. Along with it went the lesser dream of expansion beyond Earth, perhaps for many centuries. But while Mars lay desolate, Earth descended into insanity. The year was 2309. The brink was really fast approaching. Europe was the epicenter of the war that became a global conflict. The nuclear firestorms of war left cities completely. The very point where culture and history once flourished became a deserted land of soot and silence. For 80 years, the world limped about in chaos, scavenging for food and rebuilding only to be destroyed once again. These were the years when language itself started to change, mixing words with Scandinavian dialects among the people of the north who survived. Out of the ruins, something new emerged. By 2039-60, the remaining nations, battered, exhausted, and fearful of repeating their mistakes, formed a single global authority. It was called Redst, and its creation marked the end of the old order. Redst promised peace, unity, and recovery. For 2 centuries, it ruled the Earth, but the peace it provided came at a cost. Redst was not a democracy, but a hierarchy of the powerful, controlled by elites who masked their authority behind grand speeches. It was efficient, but unequal. It kept humanity alive, but it did not set them free. Power didn't just change hands, it changed purpose. And then a thinker named Toru Hild proposed something even more radical. The Great Turn. From the ashes of Redst, humanity stepped into something entirely new. No longer ruled by dynasties, corporations, or self-serving politicians, society turned its gaze to thinkers. Philosophers, scientists, and healers assumed the mantle of leadership, reshaping the values of the age. But the true transformation came in the 2800s, when a visionary named Toru Hild proposed a model of life so different that it broke the cycle of scarcity and greed that had haunted human history. Hild's idea was disarmingly simple. Society should guarantee sufficiency for all. No one should live with less than what was needed to survive comfortably, nor hoard so much that others suffered. It was not communism nor capitalism, it was something new. Education, healthcare, and leisure were distributed as birthrights. Work did not vanish, but its meaning shifted. Everyone was expected to give 2 years of service to the community, and after that, individuals were free to choose. Work in the arts, pursue science, or simply live quietly. For the first time, money ceased to matter. Wealth was no longer the measure of a person's worth. Instead, dignity came from knowledge, creativity, and contribution. Centuries of effects resounded. Art flourished unshackled from patronage. Science leapt forward unhampered by corporate strings. And so did life. Competition melted into cooperation. Children grew in a world where envy and want were things of the past, almost unfathomable for Dienach. Viewing his world gone under greed and war, this was a society not of saints, but of ordinary men who had redefined success itself. Actually, even after this tremendous shift, there was no stopping the change. The human beings in centuries gone past sought something yet more audacious, the needlework, sometimes referred to as the needlework of the mind. The process actually altered the human brain itself, taking away fear, anxiety, and dread of death. Those who had this procedure done swore after overwhelming joy, a terribly profound serenity that nothing would disturb. People lived without fear, without pain, without death's shadow weighing on their shoulders. For some time, it seemed really perfect. But the diary of Dienach mentions a rather disturbing price. Just as the body could not continue to live without the warning of pain, so also the mind could not bear infinite happiness. People who had undergone Nebel work often died suddenly, as if the very happiness had burned them up. It was as if joy that was too far beyond natural limits turned into a kind of poison. Such a finding shook even the wisest of the age. Thus, man attained peace, but found himself in the paradox. Too much happiness could slay. The earth was forever undergoing changes in its shape, and 39 centuries passed when the sky, the so-called space above humankind, continued to remain enchanted by mysteries. The very idea of aliens being known to everybody was not supposed to be a secret. Life was known to be in existence across the galaxy, within the solar system even. Their odds were weird. They did not form treaties or launch into amicable relationships. They spectated. From time to time, they would intervene without fail at the critical junctures, as if to give a gentle shove to humanity back onto its path. The shock of that revelation to him was unbelievable. His contemporaries had speculated on the possibility of life elsewhere in the universe. In 3906, that was settled. We were not alone, and perhaps never had been. Dienach wrote it all down, and then his pages nearly vanished. What happened to the diary is a story of war, secrecy, and stubborn belief. The diary's secret life. If Paul Amadeus Dienach had simply told his story and kept it to himself, it might have vanished with him. But before leaving Greece in 1924, sick and fearing for his life, he entrusted his greatest possession, hundreds of handwritten pages, to his student, Georgios Papachatsis. At first, Papachatsis believed it was little more than practice material, a way to improve his German. Only as he worked through the dense text did he realize what he held, not a novel, but a diary describing life in another body, in another time, centuries ahead. Papachatsis had been working on the translation for years, until wars and political disasters interrupted his course. By the mid-1940s, soldiers had even seized Dienach's German manuscripts, believing them to be coded messages. As a miracle, however, Papachatsis had completed part of the translation, taking care that the matter remained intact. What a mere translator couldn't give out in public was too strange. Friends interested in philosophy and theology, as well as some Freemasons, insisted that it was what they called a sacred record, a warning to a select few. It had remained in their keeping for decades, though copies of the manuscript were made, and while they were essentially interested, would be kept from public knowledge. Papachatsis, however, attempted to publish the diary during Greece's dictatorial regime in the 1970s. Such endeavors fell into disarray with the protests that had erupted in political tumult and then clashed with such vehement opposition from religious authorities who branded it more of heresy. The book pulled itself out of attention almost as quickly as it appeared. A second edition appeared in 1979 but sank again into oblivion, with mentions only in incalculable circles. The world seemed to conspire to prevent Dienach's vision from spreading. Years later, however, an effort was made to revitalize the diary. Editors smoothed its rough passages, clarified its archaic language, and then entitled it Chronicles from the Future. Yet doubts remained. Was this the fever dream of a sick man, a hoax designed to stir curiosity? Or was it exactly what Dienach claimed, a record of a consciousness hurled forward in time? And then came the modern echoes, the cases that made one pause before dismissing Dienach altogether. The first story is of Ponomarenko Sergei, a 24-year-old, unconscious young man arrested by the police in Ukraine in 2006. He had an old Soviet ID card, was dressed in a 1950s wardrobe, and held onto an old camera. The developed film showed Kiev as it looked some decades ago, and perhaps even some weird bell-like craft in the sky. It was later corroborated that there was indeed a man of that name reported missing in 1960. Ponomarenko's greatest mystery was that he had simply vanished from a locked room in the clinic, a room he entered but had never left. To the skeptics, these kinds of stories look like hoaxes, tricks designed to titillate the masses. But for those with first-hand knowledge of Dienach's diary, they stand as a reminder that the impossible sometimes leaves telltale signs, or a photograph. His account of humanity's wars, the wars of Redst, the reforms of Toru Hild, and the Nebelwerk stands in that liminal place between prophecy and delusion. Yet each most recent decade casts a shadow of plausibility. Climate stress, resource wars, tests in neural technology. That future looks less and less like fantasy and more like some roadmap we seem to be following, with great unwillingness, to the present day. If this journey through 3906 rattled you, say so below. Do you think Dienach saw our future, or built a cautionary myth? Like, comment, and subscribe for deep dives into hidden histories and impossible claims. And when you're ready, watch the video on time travelers who left physical evidence. It's on screen now, and it might change how you read tomorrow's news.